that violate her or his conscience. This is where that doctor's claim comes in. Right? There are laws in place in numerous state legislatures. There is federal policy involving healthcare, so at the federal level, that actually protect pharmacists, protect pharmacists and doctors from having to perform procedures that violate their moral conscience, or moral conscience here is when they have to demonstrate it, but is rooted in some religious claim. There is no opt-out for people posing a secular ethics. Religion is the special case exemption, right? And this is, this is not just an abstract political question, why is religion a special case? It has real world effects. During the administration of George Bush, the Department of Health and Human Services issued regulations that protected any healthcare worker or hospital from lawsuit or other challenge for refusing to perform an abortion or other procedure to which they have a moral objection. The Obama administration rescinded these restrictions, but Obama is on record as endorsing some kind of conscience clause protection for healthcare workers. This too will get worked out in healthcare reform, right? And just think about, there are pharmacists in the United States who are protected under state law when they refuse to fill a birth control prescription. This isn't, never mind RU486. Will just not fill a birth control prescription for a woman they know not to be married. Right? And this is actually a huge healthcare burden for women, particularly women of limited means, and in rural areas where they have to travel a great distance. The nearest pharmacy might be quite a distance away. They might not so easily be able to go to another pharmacy and have their insurance covered if they're lucky enough to have insurance in the first place that covers contraception, or lucky enough just to have insurance, right? So these have very real world effects. And this is posed as a solution to the supposed opposition between religious freedom and sexual freedom, right? So a particular kind of framing of the secular dilemma and of religion and sex as opposed has actually produced a series of religious exemptions that have ramifications not just in sexual life, but for people's basic choices about healthcare as well. And when I think about this is now, the way this is playing out in the gay marriage debate, and the doctor here is actually speaking euphemistically to something too, is that every state in the United States that has come to recognize same-sex marriage has a religious exemption in it. A religious exemption that to me seems to be utterly in the spirit of disestablishment and free exercise. Like, utterly in keeping with free exercise and disestablishment. Basically, the religious exemption is this. Again, marriage is supposed to be a civil contract, right? So no church, synagogue, or mosque can be forced to perform a marriage it does not recognize. So a church that objects to same-sex marriage is not going to be forced to sanctify it. That religious exemption is written in. And religious exemptions have also been written into a lot of the state anti-discrimination statutes, such that religious organizations aren't held to the law in the same way, in terms of the hiring and firing of employees, for example. All right? Now, in New Hampshire this summer, when they were debating a same-sex marriage law, and the governor did finally sign it, he signed it on the condition that religious liberties were protected. So again, you see this opposition that sexual equality is the opposite of religious liberty, and the only religious liberty imagined is a religious liberty that is conservative when it comes to sexuality. Again, a really narrow framing with real-world effects, and the version of religious liberty protections that are passing are getting wider and wider. So that one of the stakes in how New Hampshire wrote its law would be whether or not, for example, a religious organization, it's not a church, a religious organization that, as opposed to same-sex marriage, would they be required to provide health insurance on equal terms to a same-sex couple as to a cross-sex couple, right? Now, this might seem like a strange debate for Canadians because you have national health insurance. But what would a national politics of healthcare look like if instead of sort of working for same-sex marriage, queers got together and said, let's work for national healthcare? Or let's form this really strange coalition about bettering healthcare for everyone, or putting this as a social justice issue that isn't about privatized healthcare, which is what marriage gives you if you're lucky. Right? There's been the conversation in the US about same-sex marriage is being framed by marketized choices around health as well. I want to show you one last video and use this as a way to transition into a conversation with you. This is an ad, brilliant ad, that was an online ad, got a lot of hits, that was during the Proposition 8 debate in California that was the ballot measure that overturned same-sex marriage in California this past November. And this is an ad that is basically framing, showing you that you can be tolerant and still oppose same-sex marriage. And listen here again for how religious liberty figures in this debate.
In the year 2000, Californians voted yes on legislation to define marriage as being between a man and a woman. In May 2008, 4 San Francisco judges overturned this legislation, ruling it unconstitutional. Suddenly, same-sex marriage was legal in California. But have the courts gone too far? And is same-sex marriage the right choice for California? On November 4th, Californians will have the chance to make their voices heard once more. This is Proposition 8, in plain English. Proposition 8 is a measure on the November ballot which will amend the California Constitution by adding these 14 words. Only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California. A yes vote will reverse the Supreme Court's decision and restore traditional marriage to California. A no vote will affirm the Supreme Court's decision and allow same-sex marriage to continue in California. As with most political issues, there are strong feelings on both sides. Those in favor of the amendment argue that strong families are fundamental to society, and legalizing same-sex marriage could have harmful consequences. Those opposed to the amendment argue that same-sex marriage is a right and won't harm anyone. There are also many people in the middle who aren't quite sure what to think. Meet Jan and Tom. Jan and Tom have 2 children and a dog. They own a minivan. Tom mows his lawn on Saturday. Jan likes to cook. Jan and Tom live next door to Dan and Michael, a same-sex couple. Jan and Tom have been good friends with Dan and Michael for years. When Jan and Tom were on vacation, Dan and Michael watched their dog. When Dan was sick, Jan brought him soup. When they first heard about Proposition 8, Tom and Jan felt torn. On the one hand, they believed in and wanted to teach their children traditional family values. On the other hand, they felt Dan and Michael should be treated fairly and equally, regardless of their lifestyle choice. Tom and Jan wondered, will same-sex marriage affect us and our children? They decided to find out. After a few minutes on the internet, Tom discovered Section 297 of the California Family Code. That's interesting, thought Tom as he read it. It appears that same-sex couples like Dan and Michael, who are in a domestic partnership, already have the same legal rights and privileges as married couples. If this isn't about rights and equality, then what is it about? And why is changing the definition of marriage such a big deal? At that very moment, Jan was on the phone with her sister Nancy, who lives in Massachusetts, the only other state in the U.S. to legalize same-sex marriage. Here's what Jan learned. Fact. In 2004, Massachusetts legalized same-sex marriage. Fact. In 2006, a Massachusetts teacher read the story King and King to her second grade class, which tells the story of a prince marrying a prince. When parents objected, courts ruled that parents had no right to receive advance notice that their children would be taught about gay marriage, nor could they pull their children from class. Fact. In 2006, Catholic Charities ended its adoption work in Massachusetts after more than 100 years of service, because the state's anti-discrimination laws required adoption agencies to place children in same-sex homes. Tom was now starting to understand. Changing the definition of marriage was a big deal and could have some very serious consequences. Consequences that would affect not only their children, but also their community. If Proposition 8 were to fail, would their church be required to perform same-sex marriages? What would their children be taught in school? Could anti-discrimination laws force citizens to compromise their values and beliefs in the name of tolerance? Was same-sex marriage really the right choice for California? Tom and Jan decided there was far too much at stake to leave these questions to chance. Tom and Jan are still good friends with Dan and Michael. In fact, they're having a barbecue together right now. You see, being a good neighbor is important, but Tom and Jan have come to an important realization. They can respect Dan and Michael's lifestyle choice without affirming and embracing their lifestyle. Tom and Jan will be voting yes this November on Proposition 8, and we hope you'll do the same. For more information, please visit protectmarriage.com.
That is, in a nutshell, the structure of tolerance, right? You get to feel good about yourself even while voting for legislation that discriminates against your neighbor, right? And I think it's really important not to think of this as hypocritical. I mean, it's not something that we want to hold good images of ourselves. I think that's so. But we have to think about how does it happen that gay marriage is actually understood and experienced as a threat to the traditional family, right? There's actually a lot that threatens the traditional family in the United States these days. And these are global issues of global economy, among other things, right? So that in some sense, gay marriage becomes a convenient scapegoat. But it strikes me, and this I want to end on this note, I do think that, you know, and I am a secularist, but it strikes me that that many secularists have done not only an inadequate job thinking about the complexity of what religious freedom might look like and feel like in practice. It might not feel so good, right? But in the particular ways in which religion has been characterized, have actually contributed to this sense of being on the defensive that many supporters of quote-unquote traditional marriage experience. And some of that, I think, then gets transferred onto gay marriage as somehow representative of all that is dangerous and divisive about secularism. So I think that one of the dilemmas is how to produce a different conversation in secular public life and realize that secular public life is not the same thing as the secular state. The conversations about religion and even through religion in secular public life are not the problem per se. The implementation of specific religious values as the values of the secular state are a separate matter. Let me end there. Because I'd love to hear what you think about these videos and also hear a little bit about what's going on in the Canadian context.